Grace isn't something we often talk about as you use. I've noticed tends to be used in Christian congregations, as in by the grace of God, sometimes speaking of God as a person who gives us this thing. There's the grace that's given. Even for those of us who believe in God, sometimes it feels different, perhaps like a force that's at once more universal and more internal. But differences aside, I think most of us believe in a spark sometimes that can light up our minds, that some might call inspiration or insight. It's a moment of clarity where we change things in our life. We feel called to something greater, even though we may explain it in different ways. And as I read about this topic, as suggested by Kai, the concept of finishing grace is a counterpart to that inspiration. After the inspiration happens, the inspiring grace, it can be a long slog for that inspiration to become reality. What starts as a flash, an idea of changing your life, sometimes doesn't always turn out to be what you originally pictured. One can easily lose hope in the difficulty of pursuing that dream, and maybe sometimes give up. So the sort of grace of the grace to finish that calls on us is the grace to not just have that moment of insight, but to close it, to hold it, to bring it in. At least that's how I'm interpreting it. It probably doesn't feel like a flash, and maybe it feels more like not simply enduring, but pulling in or holding on to a part of yourself. So 14 years ago, 14, is it? Yeah, when my wife's health was at a low point, I quit my work and was a stay-at-home father for a time. When I had the inspiration to go back into to school and become a teacher. I applied and went into the Stanford teacher education program. But after completing this with some difficulties in going out into teaching, this was around the time that my divorce happened, and between my house, raising my son, and the keeping up two households, I could not keep working together here in the Bay Area, certainly on a teacher's salary. So I ended up shifting to higher paid tech work, although I did shift into work in educational technology. So if that was my inspiration, I move ahead to now. It's 14 years later, and I still remember that inspiration. And it's not the same, but I still feel drawn to working in education, even though there's a pretty large gap in my resume now. I know my plans are as yet unformed by this, but I think I still feel of it as something to finish. For other parts of my life, that inspiration may come in different forms. Finishing doesn't always mean changing career or changing your life, and certainly won't always be the way that one initially pictures it. Maybe wanting to write a book comes as letters to the editor, or speaking to friends in organizing, or perhaps reflections at a religious fellowship. Maybe wanting to perform in a group turns out to be a wonderful experience between friends rather than to audiences in a theater. There are many tasks which are never finished in some sense, like being a parent or mentor. Whatever lives we touch, they are connections that last forever. And these are never finished, but one still has this grace to complete, to complete each part of that mentorship, of that parenting, of teaching, of speaking, and bringing our message out. I don't know what will happen with restarting my teaching career, but with grace, I will know it will be possible in some form. Thank you.
You know, we're good sports with that hymn. I promise you it's relevant. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here together. Huge thanks to Hanju and Dawn, because these are the folks really who make the service. Dawn doesn't know this, and I was lamenting not having a closer connection to the music this time around, but you played one moment in time as people were coming in, and that's what I would have sent you for us to do, but we never talked about it. So great minds think alike. We often talk about other kinds of grace, but I think Hanju's right. In our UU context, I don't think we talk about grace enough. And I think that when we don't, we're missing out. And if we do, it's more likely to come up in the context of your healing, physical or emotional healing, or a medical report that isn't good, something that you're responding to. Grace for inspiration, if you need an idea or need to get started. Certainly getting started is tough for people. If that weren't so, we wouldn't have this thing called procrastination that lots of us indulge in. And a grace of endurance, I think, is really familiar to people, and that's the grace that lands in that middle space, right? When something's already started and you have to make your way through. And usually, if we're enduring it, it's because it's something we didn't choose, or we're enduring something as a result of a regrettable choice that we've made. So grace of endurance, like when there's, often it's second chakra issues, right? Enduring something happening at work, enduring a financial problem, enduring a relationship issue. And usually it's with our more significant relationships, because if they weren't significant, you wouldn't endure it, right? And then there's the grace of guidance that I think a lot of us invoke without really calling it that, but like, help me, or I need something, or I need insight. You're sort of aware of that need, even if you don't call that grace. And then there's the grace of revelation, when you're trying to see something differently. You know, I so often feel like if I just knew this one thing, or there's something I can't see, and when you see that, things fall into place, even if you don't like the picture. Those are the ones we talk about most often, I think. But I don't know that I've ever sat down and heard somebody talk about finishing grace, which is really interesting to me, because more and more I meet people who are struggling with bringing things to completion. I can't prove this, but I happen to think there are a lot more unfinished great American novels than finished ones. I have a few in my drawer. And speaking of drawers, I have kitchen drawers that I've started to organize. I have closets I've started to redo. I know people who've started wonderful diets. I know people who've started amazing exercise programs. And those are all good things, and good on you for the grace of inspiration, right? And sometimes we make it through inspiration, through the endurance, and then what happens? Nah, right? Long enough, or something else takes priority, or we have some great rationalization for it. So I wish I could tell you that I came up with finishing grace, because I'd be feeling really swell if that were my own idea. It's not. It comes from a book called Stay in the Game. But as soon as I saw that term, I thought, that's it. Those are the words that I've been looking for. And so I became interested in what is different about the quality of that kind of grace and what we need to finish something. Because there must be a need there, or a whole lot of us would finish a lot more things. So how does grace work in that space? That's what's interesting to me. And so I probably should pause and perhaps define grace for our context, because as Hanju mentioned, sometimes people associate that differently. One of my favorite translation definitions for grace is undeserved kindness, because that's one of the ones that's true and is less likely to offend people. But I've also found if you're going to run in UU circles and you need to say something safe that is unlikely to offend anyone, your best bet is to invoke Mary Oliver. So for my own personal safety, I'm going to do that now. Mary Oliver, and some of you may know this quote, says, "You can have the other words, chance, luck, coincidence, serendipity. I'll take the grace. I don't know what it is exactly, but I'll take it. And I'm here to recommend that we should too." So it's also at this point in the service for personal safety, I probably should issue a content advisory. I feel I have to do that now because I do, on occasion, use the word God. Sometimes I don't even notice that I've used it, and people have reactions, which you're welcome to. You're also welcome to replace that word with a word of your choosing anytime I say it, so I might say that one. So, one of the things when I'm trying to figure something out is I love sacred text, because I always think, they knew something or it wouldn't be hanging around this long. So I started looking for examples of things that were finished or language around finishing. And so I looked at the creation account in Genesis, right? And it's not as if God got started and said, "Dang, this is hard, I'm going to stop." Right? Or, I'm bored, I'm going to go do something else. I'm going to go create another galaxy now. Maybe, but that's not the record we have. The record we have says that that was brought to completion, for which I'm grateful, right? In the Christian tradition, one of my favorite figures is Mary, because if you know me, you know I'm what is affectionately known as a Christmas nerd, all things Christmas, all the time. It's Christmas in July, by the way, started yesterday. Don't miss it. Anyway, I love the story of Mary, and there's a lot of attention around that birth story, right? But it's everything that happens afterwards that matters. And I gotta think, I wasn't there. I'm not in Mary's shoes. But I gotta think it's no picnic to watch people harm your own child. And certainly that's recorded in Scripture that Jesus said at the conclusion of that, "It is finished." There's very few things he's recorded as saying directly, so we pay attention when he does, "It is finished." And that Mary was there, that she knew that her role was not just to start something, but to see it through. And what she had to see through was much harder. No one would have blamed her if she had said, partway through his ministry, "This kid's going to get himself in a lot of trouble, and I'm not going to watch. I'm going to go hang with my human children." Then I think about, we have Jonah, the story of Jonah in the belly of the whale. Well, if he'd stayed there, we wouldn't know the story because he would just be digested, and where's the miracle in that? But he hung out, and he saw it through. Or the trials of Job, which I feel like was written solely for my professional life. I just reflect on it when things are not going well. And we wouldn't care if it was just a tale of misery, because we'd be like, skip that guy, he's such a victim, right? But he comes out on the other side of it. So the fact that he finishes matters. Or the letters of Paul, controversial figure though he is. I can't imagine having to write from prison every day the way that he did, and so many references to, "I will run my race. I encourage you to run your race," all of those things. Then we have the Garden of Eden that starts at the beginning, and again, it wasn't just, here it is, we're not going to write anything else, you all figure it out, right? Here it is, something goes drastically wrong, and we write a whole bunch of things trying to figure that out, and I think the fun of Revelation in the end is that it points back to the new Eden, that things are finished. There will come a time when things are finished, and this idea that finishing is important. So here's the deal with grace. Whatever you want to call it, I happen to believe it's around us all the time. The difference between people who we associate with having grace or being graced or benefiting from it, the only difference is they had the good sense to tap into it, which all of us can do at any time, because I'll say this too, it's been my experience, grace does not care what religion you are, despite what people say. It does not discriminate, and it does not show up for some and not for others. If grace picked and chose who it shows up for, we would live in a very different world. But the good news of that is that you can activate it as you need it too. And that there's a sense that it comes online when you need it. One of the markers I think that potentially distinguishes finishing grace from the other graces is it's the one that hangs out in the back. It's like that extra fuel tank that you hope you'll never need, the generator for that time when you're going to have an extended power outage, something like that. You don't use it all the time, and so in fact, because you don't use it all the time, it's easy to forget that it is there. And it's easy to get mad if it doesn't show up sooner. Finishing grace seems to have a cagey sense of humor, and it says, no, I'm going to wait. You might want me, but I don't actually come to work until you need me. And I'll do that, but if you invoke me, perhaps I can be convinced. So I think of finishing grace as the grace with the sense of humor. And here's how I know the difference between the people who are activating finishing grace and the people who are not doing it yet. If you are not in touch with that substance we're referring here today as finishing grace, you will talk yourself out of anything. Fairly quickly and fairly easily, too. What would they say? It's too hard. I'm so busy. There's so many other things. I'd rather, right? Any of those phrases, if you catch yourself saying them or even thinking them counts. Think, oof, I could tap a different direction. I could think about invoking that special strength that comes for crossing the finish line. And here's the thing, too. I think that a lot of times we're taught, and sometimes I hear this in more new agey type circles, like everything should flow, everything should be easy. That's great when you get it. But I think if you're really going to hardcore pursue your highest potential or destiny or whatever nouns go there, I think you're going to meet resistance. And I think meeting that resistance is not, in fact, a marker that you're on the wrong path, but sure indication that you're on the right one and that you should persevere. So if you've done your run with the grace of endurance and you're pretty worn out and you've mostly done it and it's mostly there and you've done a pretty good job, you have an opportunity to tap into the next one, the boss level of grace, the finishing grace. And I think it's important, too, to keep in mind that people cannot see the desires of your heart, and they cannot see what heaven has ordained for you personally. And I do believe that we have those things. I'm a walking example of that. Very good doctors told my parents when I was born that I would never walk. And they believed they were doing my parents a favor. I absolutely believe that. I'm very much thrilled to have spent a lifetime in physical therapy proving them wrong. So you don't always know. In my career path, and some of you who know me well know this, that several years ago I very much had the desire to be a head of school. And so many people said, but that's not who you are. You're a teacher. You don't like administrative stuff. Yes, I do, and I've been a head of school for 3 years. But all of those people who said that to me meant well. And all of the ones who said I had no idea what I was getting into were also absolutely right. It's been an exhausting 3 years. And I can feel it coming to an end. That is the other reason, a way that you know that you're in touch with finishing grace is the more you do it, the more you'll have a sense of your mission winding down, because finishing grace will tell you that. You'll have some sense of like, I'm going to kick in for the final power boost. I'm going to give you that lift and have the good sense to know when we're done and go find grace of inspiration while I'm taking a break for the next thing that comes in. So it's learning and continuing to learn. I think lots of us are already in touch with this. Continuing to learn what you're being called toward. That'll get you to finishing grace every time. Now, I can slog through just about anything, but I'm also struck with the number of times, if you look at metaphors of flame and light and chalices and torches, there was this idea, especially for athletes, if you were doing torch running, if you finished first, but your torch did not stay lit, not so much there. So there's this idea of finish with the fire still in you. Finish with the joy. That's finishing grace. You can also drag yourself across the finish line bitterly, and I suppose we could argue that that's better than not finishing at all, but if I had my choice, I'd rather finish it with light and joy, and that's what grace helps you to do. When all of your circumstances in the physical world tell you, you should be bitter, this is awful, no one else has to deal with this is the worst, finishing grace will say, man, you've been dealt a rough hand. Okay, Cookie, let's go, right? It's a totally different way of looking at it. In the same books, Stay in the Game, when he was talking about finishing grace, the author also talks about, and I read a lot, like most of us. I don't tear up at everything I read, so when I tear up at something, I sort of pay attention because I think, oh, that's important for some reason. And he referenced, some of you may know this, from the 1968 Mexico City Olympics, the Tanzanian runner who dislocated his knee during the run, injured his shoulder, was of course the last one to come in, came into the stadium hours after the race was over. Very few people even still there. And the ones who were there cheered mightily for what was left of him. And he was interviewed by a journalist after that and said, why? Was asked, why did you do that to yourself? No one would have faulted you for stopping. And he said, and I love this, he said, because my country did not send me thousands of miles to start the race. They sent me to finish it. And so it is with us. I don't think we're here just to start things. I think it's important to look at our life and what we have to give and what we are called to, what we are meant to do, because we have been sent to finish. And we're none of us finished yet, or you wouldn't be here. You'd be doing something else this morning. I think about, when people in their last moments, when their life ends and when they cross over, what are those last words? What do people say? What would I want mine to be if I was still speaking in that moment? What are somebody else's last words? What will other people say about us when they look at our lives? Like that runner, will they say, nobody would have blamed you, the odds were against you, but look what you did. Look what you did, and I remember that. And I don't think it has to be anything big. You could go home and restart that diet after lunch, of course. Go have a big lunch because you made it to church. But you could restart anything. It doesn't really have to be big. It can be small. In fact, small things are really good because that's the training ground. That's where you're going to learn how that grace talks to you, because it talks to us differently. So if you need to learn how that grace talks to you by organizing the forks in your kitchen drawer, be my guest. I think that's just as valid as the great things and the great big dreams. But I think it is also true that the bigger the things we want, the larger the desires of our heart, the more we benefit from that. And the more it behooves us to finish the races we start, no matter how long. But there is this too, and I think this is really important. When we imagine a race, we think of racing against other people. And I would say here, this is what sets finishing grace apart, because it doesn't ask us to finish first. It helps us to finish. And no two of us are asked to run the same race. We are only called by heaven to run what is ours. Nobody else can see the path set before us the way that we can. Nobody else can hear the guidance that has only our names on it. And this is why well-meaning people say all kinds of lovely, crazy things to you that I recommend you listen to half of. But remember that, because I think oftentimes our greatest troubles that we have to get ourselves out of are when we compare ourselves to somebody else that we perceive is in the race with us. And we're not. At the end of the day, it's only ours. And if we run the ones that belong to us, we'll know what it means when in sacred text it says, trust that God will bring you to a flourishing finish. It doesn't say trust that everybody, trust, look around and find yourself lacking. No, trust that you will come to a flourishing finish. And so if I had one hope for you as you go out into your week, it's to pay attention. If there are things that you want to finish, that grace is already there. You just need to tap into it, and that pesky second engine with a sense of humor will be there, and you will be brought to a flourishing finish. Blessed be.